We're going to talk about reproductive behaviors, and this presentation is going to be super short. As you know, when a mommy loves a daddy very, very much, they share a very special hug, and 9 months later, a beautiful baby is born. That's it. That's the end of class. Okay. Bye. Have fun. Just kidding. From a biological perspective, sex has one purpose. Now, from a social perspective, there are other purposes for it, but the purpose of sex is for reproduction, right? Our genes want to spread as much as possible. So the more sex that you have, the more likely your genes are to reproduce and increase variation in the gene pool. More variation means more survival of the species, right? Uh, if there's variation, then that means that the species is able to adapt to changes in the environment. If one species develops darker pigment, then if there's a lot of sun, that variation is going to be more resistant to sunlight. Or if one species or one segment of a species develops a different pigmentation that allows them to blend in with their environment, it might help them avoid predators or help them hunt prey. So these changes that happen evolutionarily can make the species more likely to be able to adapt and survive in their environment for a long period of time. So when we're looking at sex differences, the differences between men and women biologically, it begins in prenatal development with the chromosomes. As you probably are aware, females in the species, if we're talking about humans, have two X chromosomes. Males have an X and a Y, typically. During an early stage of prenatal development, our genitalia are you can't tell the difference, right? It takes a second, and by a second I mean a few months of development before you can tell the difference between a male and a female. So we will both have a set of Mullerian ducts and a set of Wolffian ducts, as well as gonads that really, who knows what they are at that point. So Wolffian and Mullerian ducts are the precursors to the male and female reproductive organs. Wolffian ducts develop into the vas deferens and seminal vesicles, and Mullerian ducts are the precursors to the oviducts, uterus, and upper vagina. So why is the Y chromosome so important? Well, the Y chromosome has the SRY gene, and the SRY gene is what causes the gonads to develop into testes, which, as you might know, produce sperm. So the testes will then produce androgens that will increase the growth of the testes and also help with other aspects of male development. They also produce a Mullerian inhibiting hormone, MIH, which causes the Mullerian ducts to degenerate. Females who don't have the SRY gene because they have two X chromosomes, their gonads will develop into ovaries, which, as you also might know, produce eggs or ovum. So here we have how things differentiate, right? So this is the undifferentiated body, but if we have the SRY gene, we'll see that the gonads turn into testes. Here we have the urethra, and we have our vas deferens right here, a little prostate there. Or we can see that these gonads become ovaries, right? And then we have our fallopian tubes and the vagina and urethra there. So the testes produce more androgens than estrogens. Estrogens are the hormones that are more abundant in females. Androgens are the ones that are more abundant in males. They're both steroid hormones, so they tell the body to do things and develop in a specific way. So steroids have 4 carbon rings, and they do 3 different things. They can either bind to membrane receptors like neurotransmitters, they can enter cells and activate certain kinds of proteins in the cytoplasm, or they can bind to chromosomes where they activate or inactivate certain genes. So turning things on and turning things off. So, in a nutshell, what they're doing is they're just signaling to other parts of the body at a cellular level to do certain things, behave in certain ways, either saying go, 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 do this, or inhibiting certain functions. So here we see some different hormones, right? We have cortisol, we have testosterone, we have estradiol, and we have progesterone. And if you look, uh, testosterone and estradiol are very similar, right? Up to this point right here, they're exactly the same. So it's very small differences in these chemical compounds, these hormones, that cause very drastic effects and these very drastic differences. Here we have a hormone hanging out right here, and it could bind to a membrane receptor, just like what we saw when we discussed neurotransmitters. It can activate a protein, or it can activate or inactivate a certain gene, which is going to cause the cell to behave in a specific way. So androgens and estrogens are not chemicals themselves. They are categories of chemicals. So androgens are primarily male hormones. The most common androgen is testosterone. You've heard of testosterone. Uh, when you're talking about anabolic steroids, those usually are mimicking testosterone. Then we also have estrogens. The most common one is estradiol. We also have progesterone, which, if you know anything about pregnancy, you know that it is one of the key hormones in pregnancy. It helps prepare the uterus for the implantation of an ovum. So once it's been fertilized, right, and it makes its way down the fallopian tubes, in order for it to be implanted in the uterus to continue to grow, progesterone is very important for that. And also, it is important for the continued stages of pregnancy. So all of the sex differences that we see can't just be accounted for by hormones. Genes on the X and Y chromosome also are responsible for our sex differences. So there are at least 3 genes that we know of on the Y chromosome that are active in specific brain areas, and at least 1 gene on the X chromosome that is active only in the female brain. So, sex hormones are associated with 2 main periods of development where a lot of rapid growth is happening. So, we have prenatal development before birth and also puberty, right? Really drastic and quick changes happening. They are going to determine how the brain and body develop and whether they develop typically male or female characteristics. These sex hormones also continue to have effects during the entire lifespan, and these can be responsible for things like pregnancy and menstruation. So you can break this down into organizing or activating. Organizing is when you're saying this is how things are going to happen in the long term. Activating is this is going to happen right now, but it's not a perfect this is organizing, this is activating, there is overlap. So things that happen early in life can exert temporary effects, or they can be long lasting. So, as mentioned before, our sex organs look exactly the same up to a certain point when they start to differentiate. This happens during the first trimester of pregnancy, and the differentiation is determined by the presence or absence of testosterone, which you now know is an androgen. So, here we can see what things look like in the early stages of development, right? It's very undifferentiated. You can tell which way it's going to develop, but you start to see the penis start to develop, even though you can still see the labial folds, right? The what is the glands will eventually become the clitoris, right? And as the development finishes up, it's more clearly defined. So really, testosterone is important in the normal development of a penis, or the absence of which will lead to the development of the vagina and the labia and the clitoris. So these hormones are important, and any changes in these hormones is going to affect our behavior. When we expose female rats to testosterone, the clitoris will grow larger than normal, and specifically, it has to be during a sensitive period. So they'll become more masculinized. The clitoris will grow larger, and their sexual behavior will become more masculine. If a male rat is lacking the androgen receptors, or if it becomes castrated, meaning that it can't create these androgens, then it's going to develop more female-like anatomy and behavior. So the presence of estradiol or other estrogens does not modify male anatomy, aside from maybe some structures internally, like the prostate gland. In general, the absence of sex hormones is going to lead to female-looking external genitalia. When women lack estradiol during early life, they tend to develop atypical sexual behavior. So, based off of how what types of um, hormones we're exposed to, we're going to develop certain sexual behaviors, those kind of inborn ways that we treat sex. So the hormones are going to affect the development of other parts of the brain. So our cortical areas, but also the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus, parts of the spinal cord, and elsewhere. So the pituitary gland and hypothalamus are important because those are regulating our hormones. Those are regulating our body's homeostasis. So they're telling our body how and when to release certain chemicals and what feels like a balanced state. So the female hypothalamus is going to generate a hormone release that occurs cyclically. If you're a step ahead of me, then you're probably thinking, it's releasing hormones periodically. What does that remind me of? The menstrual cycle, right? If you're male, hormones are going to be released more steadily. And it's not a cyclical thing, it's just more of a consistent release of hormones. So, one of the key chemicals in development is what's called alpha fetoprotein. And alpha fetoprotein is in your blood during your early sensitive periods. And what it does is it binds to estradiol and prevents it from entering developing cells. Because estradiol doesn't enter those developing cells, it can't exert an effect on those cells. So, if you are female, you're not going to be exposed to it in this early sensitive stage of development. if you are male, testosterone doesn't bind to alpha fetoprotein, so it can freely enter a cell. And then it can be converted to estradiol, and then it exerts the effects on development that testosterone exerts. So let's just very quickly see that there are some differences in the hypothalamus in male and female brains. So, for example, in our medial preoptic area, we're seeing more dendritic spines and synapses in males. In the ventromedial nucleus, we have more widely branched dendrites in males. And in our arcuate nucleus and anteroventral paraventricle nucleus, we have more dendritic spines and synapses in females. So this slide says sex differences, but I also wanted to clarify that some of these are gender differences. So boys and girls, typically boys we see play with cars, trains, balls, and guns and play roughly. Many girls play with dolls, tea sets, and play cooperatively. These preferences tend to be consistent over time, but as they point out, this is partially due to socialization, but also due to the general preferences of each sex. This also represents typical presentations, right? We see some girls who like to play roughly and play with cars and trains and balls and guns. We see some boys who enjoy playing with dolls, tea sets, and play cooperatively, right? These are what we typically see, and it's very hard to separate culture from behavior because if we're studying sex in our own culture, we're going to see a lot of what we create in our own culture. So, for example, baby monkeys also show the same preferences, but to a lesser extent. So, as we can see, if we're just comparing toy choices between male monkeys and female monkeys, male monkeys have an almost equal preference for all types of toys. Female monkeys, interestingly enough, about half of them prefer neutral toys. I'd say, what would that be? Less than half. Boop, boop, boop. That is one third. That's exactly one third. There we go. We figured it out. About a third of them prefer girl toys, and 1/6 of them prefer boy toys. So even though there doesn't seem to be a preference in male monkeys, female monkeys tend to have a bit of a preference. The hormones that you're exposed to as a child, specifically during these very sensitive periods of early prenatal development, are going to affect your later development and your sex differences. So, if you are a woman born to a woman with high testosterone levels while she's pregnant with you, you're going to show a slightly elevated preference for typical boy toys. Boys born to women with high phthalate, which is found in like perfumes, food packaging, and other things. If they have high levels of that in their bloodstream while they're pregnant, they are going. Those children are going to show more interest in typical girl toys, right? Once again, it isn't just hormones. It also has to do with how you are raised, right? If your parents only buy boy toys or girl toys for you, then you're going to see that you're going to have a preference for what you've been given and exposed to. So at any time in our life, these sex hormones can activate and modify our behavior, but our behavior can also influence the secretion of hormones. So if I'm eating a lot of protein and I'm exercising every day, I'm going to release more testosterone, right? So oxytocin is another hormone that you should be aware of. It's important for reproductive behavior. And in the case of delivery of a child, if you need to have some uterine contractions, That would be oxytocin helping you out, and also it stimulates the mammary glands to release milk. So testosterone, the androgen that you've heard at least a million times by this point, is associated with sensitivity in the penis. It also binds to receptors in the hypothalamus, especially the ventromedial nucleus, the medial preoptic area, and the anterior hypothalamus. It can trigger the release of dopamine in the MPOA and other areas. In case you didn't know, there are actually 5 different types of dopamine receptors. So when you see things like D1 or D5 or D2, it's because they are different dopamine receptors. So if dopamine is stimulating the D1 or D5 receptors, that is associated with sexual arousal. So if you have a penis, think the D1 and D5 receptors for your ability to get and maintain an erection, but also sexually receptive postures in females are related to D1 and D5 as well. Now, if you have higher concentrations of dopamine stimulation in D2, that can lead to orgasm. Thank you, dopamine. You're a good friend. The neurotransmitter serotonin decreases sexual activity by blocking dopamine release, which is why, if you did not know this, some antidepressants, which can modulate our receptivity to serotonin, can decrease our sex drive and make it more difficult to orgasm. So this is why we talk about how all these things aren't separate, right? So treating depression can cause issues with our sexual function, can cause issues with our appetite. Know how dopamine is related to sexual arousal, and also know how serotonin is related to sexual arousal. This is about to be used as an excuse for all terrible behavior, but testosterone is related to sexual arousal and the drive to seek sexual partners. Married men or men in committed relationships tend to have lower testosterone levels. Men with higher testosterone levels tend to more often than people with lower testosterone levels seek additional sexual partners, even if they're still in a committed relationship. Just anytime you cheat on somebody, just go, I can't help it. My testosterone's too high. Exactly in that voice. And they'll have to forgive you because you're not in control of your actions. It's just testosterone, right? If you blame the chemicals in your body, you can get away with anything. I just spoke with a lawyer, and apparently, if you blame the chemicals in your body, you will still go to jail. So don't do that. So, if you look at the relationship between testosterone levels and sexual interest, there is a direct correlation. If you are castrated, which is the removal of the testicles, either surgically or chemically, that is going to decrease sexual interest and sexual activity. Low testosterone is not typically the reason for sexual impotence. So it's not necessarily related to whether or not you can create a child. Usually, you're seeing issues with blood circulation. In women, the hypothalamus and pituitary gland interact with the ovaries to produce the menstrual cycle. It is a cycle that lasts about 28 days. At the end of a menstrual cycle, The anterior pituitary releases follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. FSH promotes growth of follicle in the ovary. Interestingly enough, the follicle stimulating hormone promotes the growth of follicle. Now you're probably wondering what follicle is. Follicle is this little fluid-filled sac where an ovum gets to hang out, right? And the follicle nurtures the ovum and also produces estrogen. So it gets this egg ready to hopefully, not depending on, from the biological perspective, your body really wants to make a baby. From the social perspective, you might not want that, but FHS is FSH is that like friend who's like, hey, so you'd be such a great mom. FSH is really promoting getting that egg ready, right? And it's reducing estrogen. During the middle of the menstrual cycle, the follicle is building up receptors to FSH. Why is that so hard to say? FSH. I'm just going to call it fish from now on, and you're just going to know what I'm talking about. It's building up receptors to fish, and as a result, the follicle produces increasing amounts of estradiol. So we're getting lots of estrogen, right? So here we have the menstrual cycle, and we can see some different hormones. We haven't talked about LH yet, but we have fish right here. I told you, I'm not going to try to say it. FSH. There we go. Why is that so difficult, right? And right here in the middle, we see this nice little peak in the hormones, right? We also have estradiol and progesterone. We can also see the changes in the thickness of the uterine lining in response to the changes in hormones. So the more estradiol that you have, the more likely your anterior pituitary is going to release fish and luteinizing hormone, LH, FSH, and LH. So our follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are going to cause follicle to release an ovum. So the rest of the follicle is going to release progesterone, and that is going to prepare the uterus for the implantation of a fertilized ovum. So it sends that ovum out. If that ovum is fertilized, then the uterus will be ready to take care of it and foster it for 9.5-ish months. And it's going to inhibit the further release of luteinizing hormone so that while that is happening, you're not going to have further menstrual cycles. So here we have the pituitary and the ovaries on a little Zoom call. Can you hear? Oh, hey, you're breaking up a little bit. You're breaking up a little bit. But the pituitary sends some follicle stimulating hormone. The follicle is stimulated. This is near the end of menstruation. It sends a little bit less. Estradiol is being sent from the ovaries. And we can see the follicle here. Estradiol is sent, and follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are sent. The ovum is released from the follicle. The ovum either is fertilized and becomes a beautiful, beautiful baby full of hopes and dreams, and in 18 years it will cure cancer, or that ovum is not fertilized and it is discarded during the period, right? And then also estradiol and progesterone are being sent to the pituitary. So if you become pregnant, then estradiol and progesterone levels are going to increase gradually throughout pregnancy. If not, then those levels are going to decline, and the uterine lining, as well as that unused egg, are cast off during menstruation. High levels of estradiol and progesterone produce heightened activities in the serotonin receptor, which can cause nausea associated with pregnancy. So, just a reminder, serotonin is related to our mood and depression. One of the side effects of some antidepressants that affect serotonin are changes in appetite. So when you see cravings that are associated with pregnancy or nausea, right, then that makes sense because serotonin doesn't just affect one thing, it affects multiple things. In addition, one thing that you might have heard of is postpartum depression. If your serotonin receptors have been being messed with because of estradiol and progesterone, and then they are suddenly changed, right, you could experience depression. So all these things in our brain and our body are connected, and changing one thing can change a series of other things. If you've ever wondered how birth control pills work, it's because they mimic hormones. They contain estrogen and progesterone, which is going to prevent that surge of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone that would release the ovum. If there is no ovum that can be released, no fetus can develop, right? It also thickens the mucus of the cervix, makes it more difficult for a sperm to reach an egg, and it prevents the egg from implanting in the uterus. So they are different pills are going to have different effects, but essentially it's just interfering with the cycle, which is why men, if you don't have female friends, you might not know about this, but if you are taking a birth control pill, it can affect your menstrual cycle. So sometimes people will have severe changes to their normal cycle. Their cycles will last a lot longer. There can be a variety of changes because we're disrupting that normal cycle. So let's very quickly talk about the periovulatory period. This is the time in the cycle where fertility is the highest. It's the middle of the menstrual cycle. Study after study have shown that women's sexual interest is at its peak during the periovulatory period, and it changes behavior, usually very unconsciously, right? We have found that women during their periovulatory period are going to be more interested in flirting. They're going to dress more provocatively, and lap dancers receive larger tips during this time. If you ever thought that science was boring, just think of the researchers with their master's degrees and their PhDs and their cool TAs who are working their way through school, who decided to do a study on whether or not women get different types of tips or different amounts of tips based off of where they are in their ovulatory cycle. If that doesn't get you excited about science, I honestly do not know what will. So here we can see the difference between autosexual activities. So these are things like masturbation or thinking about sex, having sexual fantasies, versus female-initiated activities with members of the opposite sex. So when we're talking about intrusive methods, we're thinking about things that interrupt sexual contact. So these are things like condoms, diaphragms, etc. Non-intrusive methods are things other than birth control pills that are not intrusive. So things like an IUD or a man having a vasectomy, right? Now, as you can see, there is a peak when there's not the presence of a birth control pill around ovulation. Same here, but when the birth control pill is being used, in some cases there's no peak or there's a dip, right? So that change in the normal flow of hormones affects sexual behavior. One of the key sexual differences between men and women is the ability to read, recognize, and understand facial expressions. When women receive testosterone, they become less accurate when they try to read facial expressions of anger, and they have a much harder time in judging a person's mood by watching their eyes. So Van Honk and Shutter did a study on how quickly someone could recognize facial expressions. So they either gave a placebo injection of testosterone. So they said, we're going to inject you with testosterone, but they didn't. It was just a saline injection. Or they actually injected you with testosterone. And they found that it took people who were actually ingested with testosterone longer to recognize the emotion. Hormones are not just for helping the egg get fertilized. No, all stages of getting this young organism to survive its childhood are determined by various hormones. So, one important thing that we do as mammals is we provide milk to our young. This is done by prolactin. It's necessary for milk production. It enables the mother to eat more than usual, and it's also responsible for some maternal behaviors. So, fun fact, you can still learn maternal behaviors even if you do not have the quote unquote necessary hormones, which is why men can also be good parents, right? The chemicals aid us, but they're not the only aspect of our development. But let's not forget our old friend vasopressin. It's synthesized by the hypothalamus. It is secreted by our posterior pituitary gland, and it's associated with a lot of our social behaviors, not just in humans, but in other species. And it's also related to olfactory recognition. So you walk into your house, you smell something in the oven, and you're like, I love that smell, right? That is thanks to our old friend vasopressin. So I don't want to parent shame, but this mouse on the right has a genetic defect that is affecting the proper development of her hypothalamus. So you can see that this mom has her cute little babies just hanging out, doing baby stuff, probably feeding and staying warm. This mother is like, no, y'all just do hang out on your own. You don't need me. You're 1 day old. You are just kick you out of the house, right? So that natural just um, we understand that um, that desire to care for another human being, it is a chemical reaction, right? So if the part that is supposed to release those chemicals is not working, then your brain isn't going to tell you that you should be, being available for these. Look at these cute little guys. Oh no, mommy, mommy, mommy. But also, most importantly, where's the dad rat? Right? He's just over here, just drinking whiskey, with the boys, right? What a jerk of a rat. We always blame the mother, but the father could have also been helping. So, deadbeat rat dad. I know that you obviously already know this, but this is a prairie vole. This is a meadow vole. It's so obvious, right? You can just tell, yeah, obviously, prairie, meadow. Now, the hypothalamus, you'll see, is a little bit larger in the prairie vole in comparison to the meadow vole, right? Now, because of this, there are lower levels of vasopressin in the meadow vole. And as a result of that, they are less likely to engage in social behaviors, right? Look at these two. They're best friends. They're hanging out, right? They're just bud. This one's like, nah, I'm just gonna hang out, read a book. Yeah, I'm not gonna go to the party. Not really feeling it tonight. So vasopressin is related to our desire to engage socially. As mentioned before, hormones are important in the quality of maternal care, but they are not the only thing. As hormone levels decline, we will see that experience replaces hormonal influences, so you can learn to be more maternal. When it comes to fathers, there is a relationship between hormones and the level of interaction with the child. If you have lower levels of testosterone and prolactin, you're more likely to spend more time playing with and caring for your child. So people vary in the frequency of our sexual behavior, the preferred types of sexual activity, and our sexual orientation. Any explanations, especially from an evolutionary perspective, tend to be pretty controversial, especially just because you can't really attribute purpose to evolution, right? These are random changes that happen that either stick around for a long period of time or don't. So saying that something developed because of something for a certain purpose is kind of a leap. You're attributing purpose to, honestly, randomness, right? So uh, trying to understand some of why we behave in certain ways, we can look at their relationship to certain chemicals and certain increases and decreases in like brain mass, but it's really hard sometimes to give full explanations. So this brings us to Darwin's theory of evolution. The idea between survival of the fittest is that individuals whose genes help them survive will produce more children. If you are alive, you can have more sex. So if people who are alive are having sex, then more of their genes will survive to the next generation. So when it comes to sexual selection, if you have genes that make you more appealing to the opposite sex, that will increase your probability of reproducing. So there's a balance between attractiveness and survival, right? So if you think of a bird, a male bird might have very bright feathers to attract female birds to make a little bird family with, right? Those bright feathers are great because the female bird lowers her glasses suggestively and bites her lip and goes, I'm going to get some of that bird, right? But those bright colors might make it much more easy for a larger bird or some other predator to see that bird and eat it, making it less likely to survive. So there has to be this balance between how attractive you are and how likely you are to survive. So this is one of those controversial evolutionary theories that I've mentioned. So Men are more likely to seek multiple sex partners, especially for short term encounters. The evolutionary explanation is that it is the most successful way in spreading genes. So if you are a manho and you just have sex with everybody, and there's a specific manho gene, and you have been just hoeing it out, spreading that seed, right? Then that manho gene is going to continue on, and there will be generations and generations of manhos. So if if the children are able to be raised without you, then you can keep on manhoing because you don't need to stick around and ensure the survival of each of your children. Now, the other way that you can ensure the survival of your genetics is by being loyal to one mate and making sure that that child survives into adulthood, right? So it's a little bit more hands-on. You're investing all of your energy into one or several offspring with the same person, but that's another way of ensuring that your genes continue on. But also, women can benefit from having multiple sexual partners. So, having multiple mates increases the resources available to the child and herself, right? If there are multiple people invested in your child, then you have people going out and hunting for you, right? There are some cultures that are openly polyamorous. The woman will have sex with multiple men, and the belief is that the mixing of multiple sperm ensures a stronger child, and as a result, all of those men are invested in the survival of that child. They're all that child's father. There's less of an importance on biological parenthood, so there's a little bit of equality there. There are some cultures where men tend to be more promiscuous. There are other cultures where women are more promiscuous. And then there are some where it's about equal. So, and you'll see here that there is no specific manho gene. So, what I said before isn't 100% true. If you take your 23andMe, you won't be able to figure out if you're a manho or not. So both men and women prefer a partner that is healthy, intelligent, honest, and physically attractive, right? Now, women tend to prefer partners who are likely to be good providers. That ensures that the child that you're holding on to will be taken care of, and also yourself. I'm not sure if you knew this about pregnancy, but sometimes it's tough, right? So if you have the ability to depend on somebody else to help you through the pregnancy, that would be a good thing to have. If you have somebody who's going to leave, then evolutionarily, that's probably not the best thing to have in order to ensure your safety and the safety of the developing fetus. Also, evolutionarily, we believe that, or some people believe that the male preference for a younger mate might come from the assumption, which in many cases is accurate, that a younger woman is more fertile. If you want to have children and you have a choice between a woman who is 20 years old and someone who's 60 years old, practically one of those two will not be fertile. I'll let you figure out which one is which. So there doesn't seem to be a reverse of that, where women in general love a fresh young man, right? Because there's not the same difference in fertility. Now, yes, men will experience a drop in fertility and the strength and health of their sperm, but it's not the same. So, Those are some evolutionary explanations for mate selection. So there are differences in jealousy. So I'm going to make a correction on these slides. In Western culture, men are more jealous at male or at female infidelity than women are. Uh, this is a cultural thing, but the evolutionary explanation is that men are worried about cuckolding, which is men are worried that they are providing resources for a child that is not their own. If you genetically are providing for another person's genes, and your genes will not survive. So that is the explanation for why men tend to be more jealous and worried about infidelity. But everyone's hurt by it, or not everybody, but either gender can be hurt by infidelity in the in you know equal amounts. So the thing that I'm going to correct is that so one, cultural attitudes towards infidelity do vary. Um, the So in French culture, for example, it's common to have an extramarital affair, and it's not thought of anything as like necessarily bad. It's considered much more normal than Americans might consider something like that, right? We might criticize a president who's had an extramarital affair, and we might condemn them and say that they're unelectable as a result of that, or say that we need to impeach them as a result of that. In another country, that's really not an issue. It would be actually odd if they did. It's like, what's your problem? Get out there, have fun, right? But there's so the book says that there's no culture that exists where infidelity is more acceptable for women, but there are a lot of polyandrous cultures where one woman will have multiple husbands. So it's kind of a misnomer because that wouldn't be considered infidelity, but it is would be normal for one woman to have sex with multiple men. For them to not have sex with multiple men would be considered odd. And any forms of jealousy among the men would be considered a social faux pas, right? In our culture, if you're male and then the person that you're dating or married to has sex with somebody else, you're like, oh, how would you let that happen? Oh, you must be so mad. In the other culture, it would be the opposite. It's like, you're mad because they had sex with somebody else. What's your problem? Like, grow up. You're acting like a child. Even the children understand that this is a normal thing, right? So uh, uh, a lot of our behaviors around sex are very socialized. So it is hard to say how much is socialized and how much is based off of our evolution and our genes. But considering the wide variety in sexual behavior that we can see from culture to culture, we can understand that it's not just based on our genes. It's not just based on what's going on in our brain. Our societies have a lot to do with how we see sexual behavior, how we view infidelity, what we look for in a partner. So let's talk about gender identity. Gender identity refers to how we identify sexually and what we call ourselves, right? So if I might consider myself a male, right? Biologically, I don't necessarily know what I am. I might know what genitalia I present with, but my gender identity is how I identify myself. Biological differences are due to are labeled as sex differences, right? Gender is how we label ourselves, and that comes from society. So society tells us men act like this, or people with these genitalia act like this, people with these genitalia act like this, but the genitalia comes from biology, that's sex. The behaviors are based on gender. So uh, many people have a gender identity that matches their sex. That is what is called being cisgendered. Cis is just a prefix that means the same. So, same gender, right? Uh, Now, we once believed that gender identity was just a thing that you could learn, but we understand that a lot of it comes from our biology, right? And not just our genitalia, but how our hormones affect our genes and the delicate interplay between all these systems that are affecting one another. The A sad story about how we understood how much of our gender identity is biological was the story of a young boy who had a botched circumcision, which is literally every male student who is listening will now have nightmares for the next week. So they had a botched circumcision. I clench my jaw every time I say that. Botched circumcision. So they it was so bad that they were like, okay, let's just go all the way with this, and we'll just raise him as a girl, and they'll never know the difference. So super easy, right? And This child's entire life, he was raised as a girl, but he always felt like something was wrong, right? So he eventually learned about what happened and had years and years of a very severe identity crisis and eventually committed suicide. So you can't force somebody to behave in a specific way. The way that they feel on the inside is how they actually are. So what can often happen is somebody can literally be born into a male body, but based off of how their hormones affect their development, they may develop male body parts, but their hormones might cause typical female development in their brain. So they might feel very female on the inside, even though they present male on the outside. So there are these very strong biological factors that are very hard to measure and see that show us that sometimes our gender doesn't match our sex. Also, sometimes somebody isn't born just male or female. You can be born intersex. The term that used to be used more frequently was the term hermaphrodite. More commonly, you're going to want to use the term intersex. And somebody who is born intersex might have sex characteristics that are a mix between male and female or somewhere in between. So you might not have a fully formed penis. So one cause of this could be that a woman releases two ova, and each are fertilized by different sperm, and they unite instead of becoming twins. Or sometimes what can happen is an atypical hormone pattern occurs before birth, and as we know, your hormones are going to affect various stages of your development, especially in the super formative time of your life. So here is what you might see in an intersex person. So you can see the beginnings of what could have been a penis, and you can see what sometimes develop into the testicles, or sometimes develop into the labia. Right, these would be the external ones. So it's kind of halfway between a fully formed penis and a fully formed vagina. Also, for those of you who were just about to correct me and say, well, technically it's the vulva because it's the external genital. Yes, I know more people think vagina than vulva, but you're right. I should just refer to it as vulva just to get that misinformation spread. So, yes, it would be halfway between the penis and the vulva, and the vagina would be in here. You're welcome. So, congenital adrenal hyperplasia is an overdevelopment of the adrenal glands from birth caused by a genetic defect. That's why it's congenital. Now, this is one of the more common causes of being intersex, and what ends up happening is cortisol production leads to overstimulation of the adrenal gland, which leads to extra testosterone being produced, which means that the female fetus becomes partially masculinized. So, about 1 in every 100 children who are born have some degree of genital ambiguity, and 1 in 2,000 have enough genital ambiguity to make their sex uncertain. So, if you are born intersex, things might develop as you might assume. When we're looking at toy preference, somewhere between the preferences of boys and girls. When we're looking at adolescent interest, somewhere between the normal interest of males and females, and then more physical aggression in adulthood, and a preference for rough sports. You can also experience what is called androgen insensitivity or testicular feminization. This is a condition in which you have an XY chromosome, so you're genetically male, but you might have a smaller than average penis or the genital appearance of a female. So, what may happen with this is many individuals may develop and identify as a female, and they might not realize that they have androgen insensitivity until puberty. So, the production of androgens is still normal, but they just can't. The receptor site that would activate when the androgens are not there, so they are insensitive to androgens. They can't. They aren't receptive to them. So back in the day, physicians recommended that intersex children be reared as girls. They were given a surgery to make them look more feminine, and they assumed that if they were raised as a female, they would just accept that identity. Unfortunately, that is not the case, right? So your identity isn't just based off of how you were raised, that's going to have an effect on it, but it's based on the interplay between your hormones, your culture, your society, your family, and any sensitivity or insensitivity that you have to the hormones that are in your body. Just so you know, cloacal extrophy is when a part of the large intestines is outside the body. That includes parts of the bladder and urethra. So what can happen is those people born with that could be raised as a girl, even though they are genetically male. But because they are genetically male, they will develop typical male interests and then later want to be reassigned as male. So the current guidelines that we have are one, we're honest with the person and family, and we want to make sure that we clearly explain what's happening. We identify gender based off of what is predominant. So what, if it looks more like one than the other, that is how we identify gender. Hopefully, with time, that improves. because it's still an issue. And we try to rear the child as consistently as possible, but we have to be aware that the child may deviate from how we expect them to behave, which is why there's an issue with forcing an identity based off of genital appearance. But this is currently how it's done. And we don't do any reductions or adjustments of clitoris or penis because that is going to affect them later, because it's going to impair erotic sensation, and that is something that you cannot fix, and you don't want to get a call from your children, Mom, why'd you do this? So that's an awkward call to have. So sometimes a male might fail to produce an enzyme that takes testosterone and makes it dihydrotestosterone. So they might look female at birth, but a penis might develop during adolescence and puberty. So they might then accept a male gender identity. Their brain is still exposed to testosterone during early development. And some of them who remain female and don't change their gender identity might feel issues with identifying as female. So even though hormones don't determine gender identity, they do play an important role. So same-sex attraction is normal. We don't just see it in humans, we see it in other animal species. Men are more likely to discover their sexual orientation early. We found that there's a lot of imprinting early on in male sexuality. So, based off of early sexual development, men kind of decide and stick with what they like. Early adolescence is also when fetishes tend to develop. From the time you're like 12, 13, 14, 15, right, you kind of know what you like, and that doesn't really change in general. That process tends to be slower for women. Sexuality and what is exciting and what is not exciting can change over time. Interest can change over time, and orientation can change over time. Interestingly enough, feminine type behaviors during childhood and adolescence are strongly correlated with being gay. Now, if you are female and you have masculine, quote unquote, behaviors, that is a poor predictor of sexual orientation, which is just further proof of that fact that men kind of at a very early age are set in stone, but women, their sexuality can change and evolve over time. There are very slight differences between gay men and straight men. So we can see differences in the shape of the nose and forehead. Straight men tend to be taller and heavier. Gay men tend to use landmarks more often when giving directions. So in a typical case, I, being the strong, straight man I am, ooh, hear my straightness, rawr, I'm so strong, grr. I might say, or you're going to go to the end of the street that is Prairie, and you're going to turn right on Prairie. You're going to go all the way down to El Segundo, and then it's right there on the corner. If I were gay, I might say, okay, you're going to go all the way to the end of the street. You're going to see a taco shop to your left. You're going to go right, and just going to go all the way down past the Costco, past the Chevron gas station, and then once you see this little like bauble shop, then you're going to stop, and it's right above the laundromat, right? So that is, we also see that more often when women give directions, but that is typical, but not how everyone does it. Genes do contribute to our sexual orientation. If you have monozygotic twins, right, identical twins, if one twin is gay, the other twin is likely gay. If one twin is a lesbian, the other twin is likely a lesbian, right? This is much lower for dizygotic twins, so our fraternal twins, but we haven't figured out what specific gene is related to this, and it's pretty unlikely that it's a gene on the X chromosome. So we're looking at twin concordance. So if your twin has a trait, how likely are you to have a trait? In Sweden, we don't seem to see too much of a difference between monozygotic and dizygotic twins, but in general, we're seeing that monozygotic twins in green are more likely than the dizygotic. So identical twins are more likely than fraternal twins to have that twin concordance. So especially in the United States, if your twin is gay, then you are likely to be gay. If your fraternal twin is a lesbian, then you are still likely to be a lesbian, but less likely than if your twin were a monozygotic twin. So, a question that is sometimes asked is if if these things are genetic traits and you pass them down by having sex with the opposite sex and creating a child, but you're sexually attracted to people of the same sex, then how do we continue to have people who are gay and lesbian and bisexual and pansexual and everything in between, right? Well, there are some theories for that. Well, sometimes these genes just might be maintained because they continue on, right? The So one reason why they continue on is what's referred to as epigenetics, right? Sometimes it's not the actual gene, but it's the expression of a specific gene. So people who are straight might have a gene that, when turned on or off, or a cluster of genes that, when turned on or off, will lead to the development of being gay or lesbian or bisexual or pansexual or queer, etc. Now, another theory is that having people in your tribe or gene pool that are gay or lesbian might provide some genetic advantage. So, for example, if there's five women in the like group, and there are 10 men, right? Those 10 men might kill themselves trying to fight for the chance to have sex with a woman. But if four of those men aren't interested in having sex with women, then it's just six men who are now trying to mate, right? So that lack of competition and that ability to focus on other things. So maybe the in that tribe, those four gay tribesmen are like, yeah, you guys can do your own thing. I'm gonna go build some huts, and I'm gonna figure out. I'm gonna invent irrigation and medicine, and you guys figure out all that stuff. And I'm just going to focus on these other things that are going to ensure that we survive. So there might be, and there very likely is, an evolutionary benefit to being to not being straight. So sexual orientation has nothing to do with your hormone levels as an adult. And if you were to compare across sexual orientations, hormone levels, you would see that there is no difference. But it may play a role in early biological development. So, stress during the prenatal period can affect the child. So, the mother's immune system may see this developing child as a threat. And sometimes, what can even happen is the mother develops antibodies that attack testosterone, and so the mother's womb becomes an unsafe place for androgens, right? So if there aren't enough androgens, then it's going to affect the child's development. So future generations or future male children to that same mother might get less exposure to androgens, which might lead to them developing into a gay child. Uh, Also, stress and alcohol might play a role. Stress releases endorphins, and this is going to antagonize testosterone and its effects on the hypothalamus. So, of course, we tested it in rats. If male rats, while developing, were exposed to either prenatal stress or alcohol, they would develop both male and female sexual behaviors. If they were exposed to both, then they had decreased male sexual behavior. So there is a difference in brain anatomy, even though there isn't a difference in the hormone levels. If you are attracted to the same sex, then your brain might look more like what it would look like if it were the opposite sex. So a gay man will have a brain that looks more like a female brain, and vice versa. So the Now some of these differences have nothing to do with sexual orientation. Some of them just deal with other behaviors. So again, you might see some differences. So, for example, you might see differences in the anterior commissure and the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Which Why? Right? So sometimes it's very hard to figure out why these differences exist. But one day we probably will. So here we have the interstitial nucleus of a straight man and one of a gay man. And this would be about the same size as you would see it if you were to look at the brain of a woman. So here we have women, straight men, and gay men, and we're looking at the average volumes. So, just in case you were wondering, that right there is a bisexual man. Now, the circles and triangles, sorry, that was like a weird almost cough. Forgive me. The circles represent participants in the study who died of HIV, and the triangles represent those who died of other causes. But we can see that the data for men clusters around here, right? More people have a higher than average volume, while for women and gay men, the cluster is down here. So we're seeing differences in the volumes of their interstitial nucleus. So another comparison of the volumes, we can see that they are male, so they have a higher volume than the women in this study, but a smaller volume than the straight men in the study. And that is that. We learned about sex, we learned about gender, we learned about sexual orientation. We saw a rat that was a loner. A lot of information. But if you have any questions, as always, hit me up in that comment section. Throw a like down if you like the video. Make sure to ring that bell icon if you haven't, to make sure you get all the greatest notifications, even though I email you anyway, so that you already probably know when I've posted a video. And if you haven't subscribed, you don't have to. It's not related to your grade. But make sure to hit up my Patreon, follow me on Instagram, like me on Facebook, download Google Plus, and how plus this or whatever you would do in Google Plus. Find me on TikTok. I'll be dancing suprachiasmic nucleus, suprachiasmic nucleus. That's all. Have fun.